Good morning, everyone. How's it going? Any questions from your side? I learned that I think it was on Monday or Tuesday that Jelle was a bit disappointed because he was actually in his tutorial all on his own. Probably nobody showed up for it. I mean, that was on Monday, I think. Where he was basically offering this tutorial to help you with your second problem set. For some reason, nobody could. Okay. So there was something in her lab. I mean, if this is true, right, you could just let us know, obviously, right? I mean, just send Jelle an email. It probably also means for us that we will not do this again, right? If we don't feel the need to have this, right? So then we probably just don't do this again, right? But yeah, so then it's also like important for me, right, to know that this is not relevant for you, right?
Maybe also a question if it's possible to take it or to put it a bit nearer to the deadline, because it's like uploaded.
You thought it was too early?
3 days and then.
So then when is the deadline? That's coming
in
now,
4
right?
days and.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
1 more week. So
Yeah.
because last time everyone went to the tutorial and no one did the problem set, and then they said that they didn't work on it here.
Okay. See. Yeah. The problem is that we have to book the room for the tutorials before we know the deadlines. That's the problem that we are facing. But yeah, you're right. Yes. Yeah. So that means you're expecting if it would be closer, then that would actually make sense to have this, to offer this.
I think it really depends on the problem set. Because the first one, I think the matter of the
Yeah.
Maybe I feel like we went through some stuff in the session already.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So maybe that's why we
Okay. Thanks. All right. So we are here. So what we discussed last week. So we're in the middle of this chapter of neoclassical growth model, right? So we've actually already done a lot, right? So 2 weeks ago we basically derived all the model, and then last week I spent, I think, probably a lot of time talking about this phase diagram, right? How this works and how we can use this to analyze the model equilibrium, model dynamics in particular. And then we also started discussing what I call model applications here, right? So I mean, it's basically like what we do, right? I mean, we define our model, we basically define our economy here. That's part one, right? And then we think about a way how we can now analyze this economy. That's the phase diagram that I give you here, right? And then we actually want to use the model as a lab, right? To now think about what's actually happening now if certain things change, or if you compare different economies, right, that have different prerequisites in that case, right? Okay, so the first thing that we discussed was about changing preferences, and what I want to discuss today is basically the one application you can actually do in this model, which is discussing fiscal policy, right? So this is basically where we are, I think, the major part today. And then we will also use the model a bit actually as a growth model. So So I'll show you a bit of what you can actually do. Learn about growth based on this. Okay. So the major discussion from last week was basically around this figure, right? So I hope this figure kind of rings a bell with you, right? We spent a lot of time talking about this, right? So we said this is steady state Euler equation, this is the steady state resource constraint, this is then the overall steady state of the model, and I mean what's nice about this way to think about the model, to think about the equilibrium, is you can also think about what happens off steady state, right? So that was basically the discussion we were having here, right? So what happens if, you wake up in the morning, your economy wakes up, right? Your economy has a steady state, or it has a capital stock, which is not yet the steady state, right? Which in this case is lower. And then you can actually think about the adjustment towards the steady state, right? So that was basically this discussion that we were having last week, which is then also like where the saddle path shows up. That was summary of last week in 1 minute. Interrupt me if there are questions, please, right? And then the first application that we discussed was that one here, right? So we said, well, now we have this model, right? Now let's use it to think about what happens if we change certain things, or And I mean, this first example here was a reduction in the discount rate, which is an increase in the discount factor, right? So basically the intuition is, what happens if your agents now wake up in the morning and they're suddenly caring more about the future, right? What happens in this economy? And this was exactly what I showed you here, right? So for some reason this pen here is not working properly today. Normally I keep this is not helpful. This is not what I wanted. Yeah. What I showed you last week, right? I mean, this here was the old equilibrium, right, or the old steady state. And now what happens? You have this increases in the discount rate. People become more patient. And what this is doing, this does not affect the resource constraint, right? For the resource constraint, this doesn't matter. But what this matters for is what households do. So for their consumption saving decision, and this is what's represented in this Euler equation, right? So which means we are shifting this steady state Euler equation here to the right, Because I mean, just intuitively, if you're more patient, you'll care more about the future, you will basically save more, which means the steady state capital stock here will be higher, right? So that's what you can see immediately, right? And then we also discussed the adjustment to this new steady state. Because I mean, what's happening here, and this is particular about these dynamic models, right? We can now actually think about how we go from that point to that point. And going from that point to that point is not like we go there immediately, but the only thing that adjusts you immediately is consumption. That was what I called the jump parallel last week, right? So in this period, when Asians wake up and they have this now change preference, and they will immediately adjust their consumption, right? Because that's something they can do, right? They can decide from one moment to the next to buy less, right? That they will do this. And that's what I represent here basically as an arrow, right? We are directly going here, right? People save more, consume less, right? And this then brings me over time back to the new steady state. But maybe also to point that out, right? It's not like this point here would not be an equilibrium, right? This is also an equilibrium, right? So maybe just to say that once, right? Steady state, the steady state is also an equilibrium. It's a particular equilibrium, right? The one where capital is constant and all these other levels are constant too, right? But this point A here, for example, is also an equilibrium, right? I mean, also in this point, all these equations that I gave you, that we defined for the general equilibrium, also all these equations hold, right? So this is an equilibrium, but this is not the steady state, right? So these are two different things, right? And that's something you can see nicely here, right? Okay, and then you can actually think about the transition, right? How we go here and people consume less, they save a bit more, this increases their capital stock, so as the investment goes up, so this increases the capital stock. And at some point, this whole thing has converged again, and we're in this new higher steady state here. Okay. Questions? All right. So then let's do another application, right? Maybe you go a bit like, people actually wake up in the morning and have changed preferences. I don't know, right? But this is supposed to be one of these applications that we actually talk about a lot, right? So this is now the effect of government spending, government purchases. So what I want to do now is I want to introduce the government in this model. This is actually a big step, right? Because like the model, how I showed you the model before, there was no government, right? There was no taxes, there was no government spending. So actually the first thing that we have to do is to introduce the government first of all, right? Okay, and there's basically, it turns out that this is actually not so hard to do, right? So let me maybe just go back. Let me just show you where the government would show up in this model, right? And just show you the most simple way to add a government to this model, right? So I mean, that's again what I want you to understand, right? I mean, all these models simplify, but you can basically adjust them in order to study what you want to study, right? And that's basically an example of what I want to give you now, right? So I'm just going back to where we actually derived the model, right? So the first question could be, does the government matter for the firm problem? Could be, but as I said, I want to show you the most simple way to introduce the government. And the most simple way to introduce the government is typically by saying we're just thinking about government spending. And on the other hand, we're thinking about taxation, right? Because this government spending needs to be financed somehow. And the most simple way is to say this financing comes from households, right? They pay taxes. They will actually pay lump sum taxes. I'll show you that in a second, right? So we are not taxing firms, right? I mean, you could tax firms, right? Obviously, you could say, why not? I say, I don't know, think about social security contributions, or you think about a tax on capital, whatever. You can have all kinds of things, right? But like in the very standard version, when you think about a government, we typically leave the firm problem aside, right? So this is why introducing government spending here, I will not change the firm problem. This is just staying as it was, right? What will change is the household problem, right? Because it's these guys that will have to pay these taxes, right? I mean, that's typically what it is, right? Somebody has to pay this, right? So where will tax show up here?
CT minus T, because we have to subtract the tax from the consumption.
Exactly, right? So it has to go somewhere. Now I cannot draw on my slides, so I just put this here, right? So you have the budget constraint, and I mean that's basically what you were referring to, this equation 5, right? CT plus, this is this KT plus 1 minus 1 minus delta KT, which has to be smaller or equal my income, right? WT times NT plus RT times KT. Right, and I mean, basically we have to subtract it somewhere, right? I mean, these taxes have to be paid. You can also either need to do that on the left-hand side, right? So this would be spending. So we can just say, let's just do this, you just said it, right? Where's this thing here? So we have to subtract taxes, right? So we have a CT minus TT here, right? So this, I mean, this is spending of the government of the household, right? You have to pay these taxes. Right? And I mean, this is already the example of what we call lump sum taxes, right? So these households here are paying taxes irrespective of their consumption, irrespective of their income, right? This is not the way how we typically are taxed, right? So like, if you think about an income tax, the income tax typically relates to your income, your labor income, for example, right? This is something you could do, right? I mean, you could also introduce a tax here, right? You could say always have to pay a certain share of this year as a tax. You could have something like this, right? Typically say, 1 minus tau times this. This would also be a tax, right? This would be an income tax, right? This tax is a bit more complicated, right? I mean, there's millions of models around where we do this, but let me for a start keep it more simple, right? And this is where we just have this, what we call lump sum, right? So I'm just really just subtracting here, right? And this is basically the only thing that changes in the, as I said, the most simple way to introduce the government in the household program, right? Because this is what the household cares about. Now I have to pay higher taxes, right? Or I have to pay taxes. Before here I didn't pay any tax, right? Or baseline portion, right? You could also do other stuff, right? I mean, you could also say, maybe, actually my utility changes. How could I think of this? Why would we put utility change by introducing the government?
Maybe my utility could increase if the government uses their spending to benefit my welfare, so I could add.
Yeah. So if the government is renovating, I don't know, swimming pools in your city, and you like swimming a lot, maybe that increases your welfare, right? That could be an example, right? Or they're renovating streets, and you like going by car a lot, right? So then that would also increase your utility, right? And I mean, that's something you could do, right? I mean, there's millions of models that do that. You would basically have a consumption utility where you say, we're actually introducing government spending here, right? That's doable, right? But again, here on purpose, I'm not doing that because it would make that also a bit more complicated. I'm also not doing that because this year is actually a very strong assumption, right? So if you do this, you're actually imposing that all the money that the government spends directly increases our welfare, which is also not true, obviously, right? I mean, the government is spending lots of money that I don't care about at all, right? So it's a bit of a trade-off, right? I mean, as always, right, the truth is somewhere in between, but this year is also very extreme if you were to do this, right? But you can do it, right? I mean, this is a model. You can, in principle, do whatever you like. Yeah. So you're right, this here should be a plus, right? So either we're subtracting taxes here, sorry, no, it's completely messed up. So either we're subtracting, where's this thing? Yeah. We're subtracting taxes here, or we put them here but down at the plus, right? It should be one or the other. Does that make more sense? Yeah, yeah, exactly. Thanks for pointing that out. Exactly, right? So either you say, I have to spend, right? If you interpret this here as spending, and I have to spend on taxation, right? So then you would have a plus here, or we subtract taxes from the income, and then we should have an increase there. Okay. So that's how the household problem changes. How does that change my first order conditions? If I do this. That's part of the beauty of this lump sum taxation, right? So if you just do this here, it doesn't show up in any of your first order conditions. Right? And I mean, that's exactly the difference, right? If you were to tax labor income, let's say, right? We would say, distort your labor supply decision, right? I mean, it comes to distortionary tax, which is, I mean, intuitive, right? That makes sense. But like here, because we just have these lump sum taxes, it just doesn't show up. I mean, in principle, it would show up here, right? Because you have your budget constraints, so there it would show up. But in terms of 5, 7, 6, 7, and 8, it doesn't show up at all. Which basically means the firm side is pretty much unchanged. Because of lump sum taxes, the household side is pretty much unchanged, right? So what's the government then actually doing here, right? And for that, we have to look at our market clearing. Where would the government show up here?
Like we already did before, our outputs spent on consumption, investion, or in this the taxes.
Or in this case, government spending, first of all,
Yes,
yeah,
okay.
it will be taxes in the next, yeah, but yeah, exactly, right? So it shows up here in that equation, right? So this is basically this what I call this accounting equation, right? It comes directly from the national accounts, right? Output equals consumption plus investment plus government spending. And there it is now, right? Here we basically set this to 0. Right? If you introduce this, you would have output equals consumption plus investment plus government spending, right? There will be, right? Because I mean, if you want your government to consume something, that has to be produced, right? So supply equals demand, and government spending is part of demand. So this is also where it shows up. So what does that then mean for my, what line is changing now? If I introduce the government. Okay, so basically, what curve is shifting, right? With my meter, like the discount factor example, I was shifting that line. What do I shift now if I introduce government spending, positive government spending?
Our function line is decreasing, especially tax.
So
Downward shift.
exactly, right? So it is this line here, right, which is our resource constraint, which is downward shifting. Maybe let me go back once where these lines come from, right? I mean, these two lines is basically just these two equations, right? This is the Euler equation, just take it in steady state. This is equation 15, right? What equation changes with our introduction of government spending now? 40 does not, right? Because 40 falls out of the first order conditions of the household and the firm problem. These two are not changed at all, right? This means that a straight line, the Euler equation, is not changed, right? It's just the same. What is changed is this guy here, right? So we basically have to subtract government spending there too, right? So you would get minus GT here, right? Because like, I mean, this is basically telling what the future capital stock, right? The future capital stock equals today's capital stock minus what's depreciating, plus what you're now producing, minus what you're eating from your production, right? Which is consumption, private consumption, but now it's not only us eating, but it's also the government eating, right? So we also have to subtract government spending in that case, right? So this equation 15 will change, right? And what happens is exactly what you said, this thing is shifting downwards, right? And I mean, you've probably seen it, right? This is what this thing here is supposed to represent, right? So So what you can see here, and I apologize, this is not the nicest way to have these lines, but I hope you get the message, right? So what's happening here, this would be our counterfactual economy. This could be 0, right? If you set G0 equal to 0, you're back to our model as we had it a couple of slides before, right? So this would be like the old economy. And this is now the new economy where we have G1, which in this case would be larger than G0, right? So that's the role that I have here, right? So government spending, G1 is larger than G0, right? And this is shifting down this resource constraint, right? And I mean, the intuition is just laugh, right? I mean, to keep the capital stock constant, you basically have to like have less private consumption if the government is consuming too, right? I mean, that really just falls out of this resource constraint, right? You just have a certain pie here, right? And you have to basically give shares of the pie to everybody. And if the government starts eating too, we have to shift on this resource constraint.
So right now we just lose basically by introducing the government in the previous stage. But like, because we haven't introduced yet the spending for the government, so the way where this government spending goes and re-enters our model.
Well, I mean, it goes somewhere, right? I mean, the government spending here is demand, right? But we also get there in a second, right? But what government spending here is doing, it is purely crowding out private consumption. Yes. Exactly.
And this goes nowhere, right?
Well, the government is eating that,
yes,
right? So yeah, but you're right. It's not. It doesn't go in the capital stock, for example. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Just for clarification, G equals T.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Actually, I haven't said that. You're right. Right. So this is also an assumption here, right? Then we're basically saying we always have this balanced budget, right? Balanced budget meaning, as a government, what I spend, I like at the same time tax, right? So I'm just like income equals spending in terms of the government. Yeah. Thanks for pointing that out. Okay. So that's what this model gives us. Maybe let's do the interpretation once, right? So what you see here now, right, this here was our old steady state, the one store, right? This here was the capital stock. This here was the old level of private consumption in the economy. Right? And now what's happening, it doesn't change the Euler equation. So what's happening here, you're directly going here to this point, right? Which means in the new steady state, we have the same capital stock as we had before, but we have a lower level of private consumption. Right? And what's different here compared to the example with the discount factor change, consumption is adjusted immediately, right? So this adjustment here happens from one period to the next. This goes immediately, right? So here in this example, I was basically, we jump immediately in terms of consumption, and then it takes some time, and I mean, this could easily be years, right, until the capital stock is adjusted, right? Until we're back to the new steady state. Here, this thing happens immediately, right? Because the capital stock is not affected here, right? So we're just immediately putting down private consumption, whereas government consumption goes up. Okay. And this is basically what you have on the slide here, right? So that's what this model here predicts. So we have this immediate adjustment, exactly. So why is that? What's going on here? I mean, you were basically already, go ahead first. Right?
Why do we assume that government spending is only used for consumption? Isn't it possible that we reduce the consumption from individuals in order to increase government investments, for example?
Exactly, yeah, very good, yeah. Is that possible or not? I don't know if you ask our government, I would question that. But, well, okay. In principle, yes, you're very right? I mean, this, you're already one step further, but let me do this, right? I mean, you could obviously say, here, this is government consumption, what I define, right? You could say, maybe government consumption doesn't affect utility, but maybe we're actually investing, right? Maybe the capital stock is built up. And that would be a different story, right? I mean, then you would have effects here too, right? I mean, you would, I'm not even sure how you would do this directly, but you would probably you would probably start from that equation. Where is it here? Basically from our law of motion, right? I mean, then the government would also be investing, right? You would not just have G, but you would have basically investment, private and public investment, right? And then you would have a different story. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly, right? So maybe maybe also to say that, what does that mean here for a multiplier, right? Like when we talk about fiscal policy, I don't know, think about an ISLM model, we typically think about government spending multipliers. What's the government spending multiplier here? Right, the multiplier typically being something like, how does output change if you increase government spending? What's the multiplier?
In this case, it's 1 in this model. We do not have any multiplier.
Yeah, that part is correct, but that makes the multiplier not 1, but
It's -1.
no. Anybody else? Basically, the number in the middle.
0.
It's 0, right? So here the multiplier is exactly equal to 0, right? You're increasing government spending, but output doesn't change, right? I mean, the capital stock doesn't change. Output doesn't change at all in this model, right? GDP is the same as before. GDP is not changed, right? We're reducing private consumption, government consumption goes up, GDP is the same. And that makes this output multiplier here exactly equal to 0, right, in this model. Okay. So yeah, that's basically this here. And I mean, what's the intuition? So basically what this here is doing is, that's what you have on this slide here, right? If the government decides on spending money, this has to be financed by taxes, right? So one way to, like, from the household problem, what that means is the government is permanently making me poor because they're taking money away from me, right? And if they make me permanently poor, I will consume less, right? And that's a very simple thing that's happening here. Right? Okay, and I mean, before we go into this discussion, is that realistic, right? And by the way, I do not consider this very realistic, right? But I mean, as I always say, you have these models to understand why this model predicts this, and then you can basically start and go ahead, what would I need to change now? What mechanism do I need to add? And you were already suggesting some, right? What could be mechanisms to add to get here something different, right? So that's what we have this model for, right? It's a lab to think about these different things, right? But let me point out one other thing here, right? I mean, I was just referring to this government spending multipliers, right? What is happening in an ISLM? Who remembers what is the government spending multiplier in an ISLM? These Keynesian multipliers.
In this kind of model, we have a positive effect. So if the government increases its spending, we have some effects that increase the output more than the factor of 1.
Exactly, right? Maybe you've seen these Keynesian crosses, right? In these ISLM type of worlds, you typically have the effect that if the government spends more, output goes up because demand goes up. That makes income of households go up. And once their income goes up, they actually consume more, right? And that's the private consumption will go up, right? And that's these multipliers. This Keynesian argument of multipliers, right? So in that models, you would have that once G goes up, actually output goes up, and that then implies that consumption goes up, right? And then you actually have, once consumption goes up, output goes up by even more, and this is where these multipliers come from, right? And this is why, I mean, basically this guy is crucial, right? And this is why we're always talking about these marginal propensities to consume, right? Because that's this, if I increase your income, how much more do you consume, right? And the larger that is, the higher will be your multiplier, right? And the reason why you get that in an ISLM is because of this consumption idea that you have in an ISLM, right? In an ISLM, we typically say, okay, consumption is a function of disposable income, right? I don't know, something like this here, right? Consumption depends on your income, right? Your current income. And this is what we have fundamentally changed in this model now, right? I mean, here you see this Euler equation doesn't respond at all, right? Our optimizing households, right? These forward-looking guys with this infinite horizon, they are not behaving that way anymore, and this is why they're not doing this, right? That's the major difference here. I'm just caring about today, right? If my income today goes up, I consume more. That's not what the households in this model do. The households in this model, they're thinking about their permanent income, right? So they're basically seeing maybe demand could go up today because the government is actually spending more, but I also know that in the future I will pay higher taxes. This is just not changing what I do, right? You care about your what we call lifetime income, right? And this is then why in these models, you don't have this effect on private consumption, we actually have this crowding out, right? In an ISLM, you actually also have a crowding out, but a very different one. I mean, you have it here on the slide, right? In an ISLM, you talk about crowding out of investment. Right? That's a very different story, right? In an ISLM, you get the result that if government spending goes up, demand goes up, this increases the interest rate, and once the interest rate goes up, you have this crowding out of private investment, right? And then we can talk about how large is that effect, whatever, right? Which is basically dampening your multipliers. This is not happening in this model. Here, there's no crowding out of investment, right? So this equation is not changed. Right? They just do the same as before, right? Here it's really like this permanent downward shift. Right? Okay. And I mean, again, don't get me as saying this mechanism is the right one or this mechanism is the right one, right? Certainly not, right? It will also depend on where you currently are, whether it's more this mechanism or whether it's more this mechanism. But both of these mechanisms are valid mechanisms, right? And you can write down economic stories why they happen, right? And then you basically need to think about what kind of role am I currently living in, right? So what do I think is currently more relevant, right? Okay. And to me, also the thing that I want you to see is really that this, I mean, I kind of started this whole discussion here by saying now we want to microfound, right? So this here is not microfounded, right? This is what gives you these huge multipliers, potentially huge multipliers in an ISLM. Once you do the microfoundation, this is what we did here, you suddenly get very different predictions of your models, right? Here in terms of government spending, right? And that's basically what I want you to see. All right. So now, I mean, I kind of want to discuss a bit, and I mean, that's already what you were getting at, I think, is what could be changed now, right? Or what would happen now if we changed certain things? Would this prediction here then change, yes or no, right? And I mean, that's, again, what you have a model for, right? You can now systematically do all kinds of things and think about what actually matters, right, and what doesn't, right? And one of the things you could maybe ask, and I mean that's basically what you asked in the beginning, right? Here we're using taxation to finance spending, government spending, right? So we have this idea here of a balanced budget, right? So whenever we increase government spending, we at the same time increasing taxation, right? And I mean maybe here you could say, is that the reason why this multiplier is 0, right? Because maybe it changes if you now say what if my government is now using debt to finance this additional spending? Does it make a difference? So who knows what recording equivalence is? What does recording equivalence say? You have it on the slide. Recording equivalent tells you it does not make any difference, right? In this model, if you now say, my government, instead of financing this here with taxation, is financing this with debt, government debt, the multiplier stays zero. This is what recording equivalence tells us, right? And this holds here in this model.
But wouldn't this affect the capital rent rates, so the interest rates for the firms? Or aren't we accounting for this now, right? Because if the government now takes debt, it would mean that the rates should probably go down as there's more capital in the market.
Yeah, no, here it would not. It would actually not, because it just doesn't matter whether you pay it today or in the future. But here would not. But it could in principle, right? I mean, that's one of the arguments why we then, I mean, that would basically be like the next slide, right? Why does it maybe not hold? And if your government pays a lower interest rate, then it does not hold, right? That's one of the things. But again, that's the next step. Okay, but yeah, this is just the short answer, right? I mean, this result here does not hinge on whether you have financing in terms of taxation or debt. Right? Shall we have a short break and then we'll discuss when this does not hold? And then the next thing, right? Right. Would you open a window? That would be great.
Die Schultern hoch, halten Sie oben und lassen Sie ganz bewusst fallen. Genau, und dabei machen wir genau das, was ihr schon unbewusst gemacht habt. Wir atmen aus. Genau. Und wir ziehen die Schulter hoch und atmen kräftig aus, Spannung ausatmen. Und nochmal halten und entspannen. Sehr gut. Wir nehmen einmal die Ellbogen in die Hände vor dem Körper und dann machen wir mit unseren Armen eine liegende 8. Also ein Ellbogen geht immer maximal hoch, einer geht nach unten. Ja, dabei versuchen wir die Schulter schön mitzudrehen, dass sich die ganze Schulter wieder ein bisschen lockert. Und davon machen wir noch 2, so wie sie jetzt liegen. Und dann drehen wir einmal die Richtung, einmal andersrum, die liegende 8 Malen. Und dann machen wir wieder noch 2. Und lassen dann die Arme nochmal locker. Dann kommen die nämlich gestreckt vor den Körper und jetzt stellen wir uns vor, dass wir in einem Ruderbund sind. Wir wollen alle kräftig in die Pause. Okay, also wir ziehen kräftigen Zug zur Brust und strecken wieder die Arme. Eng am Körper entlang rudern, genau, und kräftig. Wir wollen ja vorwärts kommen. Und wieder gut. Sehr schön. Und zu. Strecken, zu. Strecken noch 3. 2. 1 und lösen. Und dann mal versuchen, wenn das geht, sich mal nach vorne zu beugen. Ihr könnt euch auch schräg stellen oder einfach über den Tisch. Es geht nur darum, mal den Oberkörper runterzulassen und so ein bisschen lang werden zu lassen. Ja, wenn ihr nicht richtig den Oberkörper stürzt, der Platz hat und nach unten geht, dann kann man schälern ein bisschen mit den Fingern, mit den Füßen. Ansonsten beugt euch einfach so vor, wie es geht, dass ihr das Gefühl habt, dass der untere Rücken ein bisschen lang gezogen wird. Und wenn ihr könnt, federt ihr noch ein bisschen, zieht euch ein bisschen nach unten raus. Und dann rollen wir uns wieder auf. Und sind im letzten Part, wir gehen in unsere Unterarme, wir fangen mit dem linken Arm an, wir ziehen die Hand nach oben, statt der Arm vor den Körper, drehen dann die Hand einfach nach innen. Und dann noch derselbe Arm. Einmal nach unten, jetzt hier auf die Finger so ein bisschen bei den Handnägel mit lang ziehen. Genau, und einmal nach außen. Hier kann man auch schön die Finger greifen und die Finger nach außen ziehen. Und ausschütteln, rechter Arm, erstmal nach oben. nach innen. Unten, hier. Und nach außen. Einmal lösen, letzte Übung, noch eine Faust. Linker Arm zuerst, wir schließen die Faust, die andere Faust um die Faust herum und dann drehen wir die Faust nach innen. Jetzt sehen wir die Außenseite des Unterarms. Diese Hand nach innen, hier die. Und dann nochmal auf der anderen Seite Faust machen, Faust drumherum, die Faust nach innen ziehen, einmal die Außenseite gehen. Und dann ausschütteln und dann bis nächste Woche. Vielen Dank.
Okay, so I was just talking about this one here, maybe just to make it clear ones, right? I hope you have seen Ricardian equivalence before. Yeah, not anybody dares to say. I bet more of you have seen that, but let me say that once more clearly, right? So what is Ricardian equivalence saying? What does it not say, right? So Ricardian equivalence does not say that government spending has a zero multiplier, right? Government Ricardian equivalence is really just about how is government spending financed, right? So the question that Ricardian equivalence asks is, does it matter whether the government uses debt or taxes to finance the spending, right? So you should not make the argument Ricardian equivalence tells us that government spending is useless, right? This is not what Ricardian equivalence is about. Ricardian equivalence is only saying you have a certain stream of government spending. Does it matter whether this is financed by taxes or by government debt, right? And why it's called equivalence, right? I mean, the equivalence theorem is basically saying it does not matter, right? These two things are equivalent, right? It does not matter for the outcome whether the government is using taxes or debt. What is the intuition? And I mean, that's what you have here on the slide, right? I mean, this is a very old concept, right? I mean, this has been noted for decades, right? So the idea is we have forward-looking households here, right? Think about our infinite horizon setting. Actually, this doesn't hinge on the infinite horizon, right? I mean, Ricardo made this point much before we even thought about writing these infinite horizon settings that I showed you here. But in our setting, it's also true, right? So I'm looking forward, right? I think about the future too, right? And the simple intuition is, as a household, I see that the government is now increasing government spending, and they finance this with debt, right? So they're taking up debt. So then, as a forward-looking household, I will anticipate that that means that this government will, at some point in the future, increase taxes, right? Which, for me, as I'm forward-looking, right, I'm not only caring about today, but I also care about my future income. I will also care about future taxes, right? Which then means I will basically start saving already today, right, for the taxes that I have to pay in the future. That's the very simple idea. Right? I mean, one underlying motive here is consumption smoothing, right? Households don't like fluctuations in consumption much, that's why they do this. And I mean, it's one of these other examples, right? Where if you take an ISLM, right, where you have this consumption function, you would not have Ricardian equivalence, right? I mean, because that was the argument that it is made, right? You get Ricardian equivalence if households also care about the future. Here they do not, right? In this world, they just care about their current income, right? So this is another reason why Ricardian equivalence in an ISLM does not hold, right? There you have a very, very different story, right? Okay. Questions so far? I mean, you can also formally prove this, of course. I bet you do this in a public econ course, for example, right? This is where I would see this. Maybe Maria's doing that too. I should ask her. I mean, it's actually relatively simple, right? If you have like, in this infinite horizon, it's a bit more difficult, but if you have like a two-period problem, it's actually not so hard to see this, right? But I also think the intuition is actually pretty clear, right? And I mean, then the next question, of course, is this realistic, right? I mean, I guess you probably know my answer. Obviously, this is not realistic, right? But this is also not what this is about, right? I think nobody, or I don't know what Ricardo thought about, but I don't think he wrote this down because he said this is how I believe how the world works, right? But the point is, we can basically then think about what are the crucial assumptions that we need for Ricardian equivalence, right? And then you can basically think about what of these assumptions do I want to relax and what is that doing, right? And then you can again think about the mechanisms, right? And I mean, you were already pointing out one, right? One major argument where we sometimes say Ricardian equivalence breaks, right? So when does it matter whether a government finances spending with debt or taxes? Is, for example, in a recession. Because what typically happens in a recession, think about the financial crisis. If like there's a financial crisis, right, banks are not really willing to give you credit, and these spreads are increasing. So then it's actually very hard for people to get credit, for firms to get credit. Maybe your government is actually still pretty good at getting credit, right? So typically for governments, it's easier and it's cheaper to get credit, which means their interest rates are lower, right? Why is that? Why does the government typically have a lower interest rate?
It has long time to pay back.
Yeah, governments typically don't die, right? That's one of the arguments, right? Normally, they do not, right? Whereas people die, right? So, I mean, as a bank, right? If you think about, do I give a loan to a person or to a government, right? Think about how old the person is, there's clearly a difference, right? So what we would say is clearly a different risk, right? The other argument also is about the government maybe is also easier to get, right? So in terms of, let's say, people don't repay the loan, right? I mean, that happens, right? Happens also with governments, right? But the government cannot simply walk away, right? The state is where it is. And it's, in that sense, there's also more, like banks typically have more information about governments compared to people, right? Well, if you think about asymmetric information, as a banker, how do I know whether you will pay back your debt? About the government, it's just much easier, right? So this is why typically governments have lower interest rates. And this is one of the reasons why Ricardian equivalence then makes a difference, right? Whether you have the government taking out debt or whether you have private people taking out debt. In particular in recessions, right? And this is one of the arguments why we typically say in a recession, we want our governments to do this and to finance this with debt, right? This is a clear economic argument why this is made, right? So this is one of these major arguments why I would say why Ricardian equivalence breaks, right? Different interest rates for private people and governments. Further thoughts?
People are not always altruistic, so that means maybe I'm not interested in the consumption level of my children.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean that's true if you have this infinite horizon, right? If you just have a two-period setting, maybe I care about taxation in 10 years. I mean that would still be me. Right? This is also one of these ideas, right? In a way, it goes a bit in the direction of, yeah, I mean, maybe I don't care about if taxes rise in the future, right? That's a bit what you said, right? I mean, this is the mechanism here, and if that mechanism is there, you get this effect. But is that really true, right? So, I mean, maybe there is a bit of this actually in the real world, right? And I mean, there's very good arguments to believe that there is, under certain circumstances, a lot of this in the real world. So one of the things we typically talk about is borrowing constraints. So the idea in these models is, say interest rates are the same for the government and households, right? I mean, we already discussed it, this is typically not the case, but say they are the same, right? Then Ricardian equivalence works because it doesn't matter whether it's the government taking up the credit or whether it's me taking up the credit, right? As the household, right? Because, I mean, basically, if you like switch this around, right, say we think about a decrease in or an increase in taxation, people would just get a credit and spend the money nevertheless, right? So that would basically be the idea. But for that, you need perfectly functioning capital markets, right? So Ricardian equivalence only works if you really have this idea that every household, whenever my income is lower than what I want to consume, I can simply go to a bank and ask for a credit, and I will get the credit, right? At the same interest rate as the government. And I mean, this is just not how it works, right? I don't know how many of you actually went to a bank and asked for credit, but it happens very regularly that people will not be granted credit, right? And this is what we call borrowing constraints, right? And I mean, this whole maximization idea that we wrote down, this whole budget constraint, and it really always works under this idea, I can't simply smooth my consumption because if my income is too low, I just ask for credit and pay that back later, right? I don't care, right? Obviously we care, right? And this is another argument. I mean, borrowing constraints are particularly binding in recessions, right? In recessions, there are suddenly many, I mean, it's not only households, it's also firms, by the way, right? Borrowing constraint firms. And then you suddenly get this UN action again, right? So then you get a situation where if the government spends money, right, he goes up, and you say you give a transfer to your households. And these guys are borrowing constrained. They actually want to consume more, but they couldn't because they weren't getting the credit from the bank. And now basically it's the government stepping in and giving these guys the money. These guys will spend that because they are at that borrowing constraint, right? These guys have a very high marginal propensity to consume. And they basically do this, right? So if you increase their income, they will increase their consumption, right? And then you're back into these Keynesian worlds, if you want, right? And then Ricardian equivalence breaks, and then you have the result of actually government spending. These multipliers can become very large. Right? And this is also something which we typically say happens, for example, in recessions, right? Another argument why we say in a recession, we believe that multipliers are large, and they should be financed by government debt, right? Good, yeah, and I mean, you can, these borrowing constraints, I mean, you can actually have this in these models, right? For that, you would need incomplete capital markets. I cannot show you that here. Maybe I should actually. haven't thought about this. But it's one of these things that in these modern macro models, so let's say the models that I work with or that we're currently discussing at conferences, this is the thing that people do, right? So borrowing constraints are super important. It's also a way, I already talked about heterogeneity, right? This is a very relevant heterogeneity, right? Some of us are borrowing constrained, others are not. And then it suddenly matters, like, where as a government do you give the money to, right? Do I give the money to the poor people who are at their borrowing constraints, or do I give the money to the rich people, which already have a lot, right? I mean, these things here make clear arguments who you should give the money to. Who should you give the money to? The people at the borrowing constraint, right? The poor guys, not the rich guys, right? This is exactly what this tells you. And I mean, this was one of the arguments, for example, that was made during COVID, right? When we were discussing, right, during COVID, I mean, that was the idea, right? We want to like provide stimulus to the economy. How can we increase GDP? How can we ensure that our economy is not fully collapsing, right? So what governments did, also the German government, right, was basically to think, well, we want to provide transfers to our consumers, to our households. And I mean, in Germany, we were having this discussion that, I mean, many economists at the time made the point these should be targeted transfers, right? Don't just give it to everybody. And that was exactly with this argument in mind, right? You want to give the money to people that will actually spend it, right? Not those people that will just like have it on their bank account and then will sit there, right? But you want to have it targeted, right? So if you talk about targeted policies, that's what that means. And the problem, I mean, with German bureaucracy and data protection was that the government said, we do not know who that is, right? We do not know how to target this money to people that are at their borrowing constraints, basically the poor people, right? The US government actually did that. In the US, they actually, like these transfers were targeted to people which had, according to their latest tax declaration, an income below X. I don't know the exact amount, right? But that's exactly what the US government did at the time, right? Which was considered like a very good policy. Do you remember what the German government did?
They, for example, make gasoline cheaper.
That's true, that's also one thing I did, which was highly questioned at the time, but okay, yeah.
They gave money to students, for example.
Exactly, yeah. With also the idea, this is people at their borrowing constraints. That's it. And there was actually also some money that I got, but who knows why? It was related to the Kindergeld, right? So people with children, they basically in I think two times, they basically topped up the Kindergeld, right? Which also the idea, basically people should have children, maybe poor, and I mean it's also part of taking care of the tax declaration because this Kindergeld, there's a certain right, tax whatever, right? But that was also something that they did, right? So they couldn't basically target it to exactly people by the income, but they targeted to people according to the students, and in terms of this, child allowances, right? Where they also, I mean, basically the government knows that because they pay me this Kindergeld every month, right? So this is why they need me and gave me some money. Exactly. Good.
But didn't they also pay every person that worked in the last like 6 months like 300 euros? I also got them, and that was also like a thing.
That was completely unconditional.
Yeah, it was just that when you worked and not did a mini job.
Yeah, that's also possible.
Yeah.
I mean, at the time, I mean, you also had like everybody was also a bit desperate, right? What do we actually do? So that they tried many things, right? Yeah. But that was really the problem, right? Everybody knew we want to target this, but how do we actually do this, right? So yeah, to me it's always an interesting example. But okay, good. Yeah. So now let me try to go back here, right? So I mean, recording equivalence to me is, first of all, I want you to know what that is, right? It's not about the size of the multiplier, right? Recording equivalence really is about how do we finance the spending. And I mean, with all these things, right, it gives us ways to think about what are the crucial assumptions for recording equivalence to hold. And then you can also think about what of these assumptions do I maybe want to change. And then what does it mean? What does that turn out then to be crucial assumptions? I believe these borrowing constraints is one of the things which is currently discussed a lot, right? But I mean that is arguably, right, if you really want to put that into a model, more complicated because then you actually need to move away from these perfect markets, right? I mean, I think I said at some point here that this economy here, everything's efficient, right? We're in our Pareto optimum, this is all very nice. And one reason is that capital market's clear, right? Supply equals demand on the capital market. To have these borrowing constraints, you will not have that anymore. We have then incomplete markets, right? So that would give you a completely different type of model to deal with. But it's basically, it all builds on this, right? I mean, I keep saying that, right? Once you have this model, you could then make the next step and add incomplete capital markets. Okay. So now, that was like my short tour into, let's use the neoclassical growth model as a model to think about fiscal policy. And I mean, I had this slide at the beginning, right, that the neoclassical growth model is a good model for teaching many things. It's not a very good model to think about real-world applications, right? And I mean, this is just one argument why. But again, it always just tells you mechanisms, right? I mean, here it focuses just on this one mechanism, that you could write down millions of other mechanisms and then this breaks. Yeah, right? But this is just a mechanism that this model points out. So now I want to use this model for something completely different, right? So government spending is a bit of this short run. I mean, this was actually a prominent change in government spending, but it makes you think about recessions and COVID and whatever, right? So now let's move back a bit and use it as a growth model, right? So growth is really like this long run stuff, right? And you can actually do this. I mean, this is kind of where this model actually came from, right? Where what it was developed for, right? And I mean, basically it falls out of the solo model, right? This is also what we do with the solo model, right? So what you typically do to have it like a real growth model, right? I mean, what happens here in this model, we have the steady state, right? And in steady state, the capital stock is not growing anymore, your output is not growing anymore, right? So there must be something else which is growing here to actually think about economic growth, right? So I mean, just the neoclassical growth model has a constant steady state, right? In steady state, there's no growth left, right? You're staying there, right? So where does growth then come from, right? That's a typical question that we ask, right? And there's at least two candidates, right? So if you think about our production function, so far we've just focused on capital. There's labor, obviously, right? So what if your labor supply changes in the sense that you have your population growing, right? So that's this typical thing that we look at into these more long-run models, right? Because I mean, in the short run, arguably, fluctuations in population don't happen that much, normally. Whereas in the long run, obviously, they play a huge role, right? I mean, then you can think about demographics, you can think about migration, you can think about all kinds of things, right? Or fertility, right? Which is kind of the major source of population growth, right? So yeah, that's what we typically introduce. So that would be growth on this L, right? And the second type of growth that we typically introduce is growth in technology, productivity, right? Technological progress, right? One way how we typically do this, and this is exactly in parallel to what you do in a solo, right? You would say, let's say we have a production function like this here, and this is just for example, you can have different ways to write this down, right? And then you have here this productivity term, right? A in this case would be labor augmenting productivity. So I don't know, think about AI, suddenly we can all use ChatGPT, which all increases our productivity, and this would be A, right? Suddenly with a certain number of hours, I can just produce much more output, right? So that's the idea, right? And then what you do with these type of models is to say, okay, I mean, that's also how I started, right? When we wrote down the phase diagram, I said, with dynamic models, you basically always need to find what we call a fixed point, right? You need something where you know where your model is heading to. You need something where you're basically staying, right? Steady state. Does it still exist? And the point here is it still exists if you rewrite your model in terms of what we call capital per effective unit of labor. So you're basically just dividing everything in your model by this productivity times L, which we call effective units of labor, right? So how productive is every unit of labor? And this is exactly what you would do in any solo, right? I bet many of you have seen that before, right? And then you can actually decompose, even in steady state, the growth of your economy, right? So you can think about, okay, then in steady state, it's still true that capital output and consumption per effective unit of labor will be constant. But once you then all think about what about the actual capital output and consumption per labor, then we just basically per capita, right? In these models, L is equal to population, right? So if I say here per labor unit, this is just the same as per capita, right? These will grow with weight G, which is our weight of technological progress here. And actually, overall, your output and capital and consumption will also grow with rate G plus N, which is technological progress, plus the change in your population. Okay. And this is kind of this famous Solow result, right, where he said, okay, now I can decompose this, and basically the major share of economic growth is due to G. Is due to technology, right? That's basically what Solow got his Nobel Prize for, I would say, right? It's not just writing down this model, but it's actually applying this model to this question and then seeing, okay, where does growth in the long run actually come from? And he said it's coming from G, right? It's not coming out of this capital stock growing, right? But it's actually coming from technology growing over time, right? Okay. Yeah. Question? The problem is a bit that this G that I just defined here, right? I mean, G is, right, this growth rate in this productivity A. The problem is that the model that I showed you cannot explain this, right? I can add this, but I add this here in an exogenous way, right? So we basically say productivity is growing over time, let's say by 2% a year or whatever, right? Maybe 1%, whatever you want, right? But it's just exogenous in the model, right? And I mean, this is in a way, this is the reason why we typically say the neoclassical growth model is not a very good model of growth, because we can explain growth, but we can explain it just with an exogenous parameter. And exogenous means it's something which, I mean, in terms of, once you think about policy, for example, right, this model then does not tell you anything how, as a policymaker, you would actually be able to affect this G, right? There's no way to do this, right? G is exogenous, so your model does not tell you anything how you can actually increase technology growth, right? It's exogenous, right? Policy cannot affect growth. I mean, maybe that's true, I don't know, but maybe it's not, right? And your model doesn't allow you to think about this. Why is the neoclassical growth model nevertheless? I mean, if you open the Acemoglu textbook, let's say, right? This is one of the textbooks that I gave you here. I mean, this is kind of the textbook for thinking about economic growth, right? He also starts with the neoclassical growth model. Why does he? Well, because all these models that we call endogenous growth models, right, where you are endogenizing this G, they come exactly out of this model, right? They build on this. So in a way, you're kind of opening this black box, where does capital actually come from, right? This is really what the neoclassical growth model does. And now you can start and think about how can we take this more seriously, right? And I mean, we will actually go back to these endogenous growth models because I believe they are very important, right? I mean, actually they were just awarded this Nobel Prize just this year, right? So I will talk a bit about this later, some point in January, where we will do exactly this, right? I mean, we will take the neoclassical growth model, and then I will show you what do we have to change to actually think about where this productivity is coming from, right? And where it will be coming from will be something like research and development, right? You will think about people in your economy not just producing goods, but you will be thinking about people in your economy actually investing and creating productivity, right? That's what you do in these kind of models, right? Okay. So yeah, in that sense, this model is also, again, a foundation for what you want to do later. Questions? Right, so this explains why I said at the beginning, the neoclassical growth model is not a very good growth model, right? Because it just cannot explain growth in the long run. For that, you have to include this exogenous increase in productivity. And exogenous is not really nice. That's something that we don't like, right? Because exogenous, we cannot explain, right? So it's a bit, why do this, right? But it is the first step towards doing that. Okay. So now I talked a long time about why the neoclassical growth model has problems, right, in terms of growth, or maybe in terms of fiscal policy. So what is it actually good for? So maybe to say that a bit towards the end, it can actually explain many things, right? So one thing is this convergence debate. I don't know if you've heard that. And again, this is also true for a solo model, right? For that you actually don't need all of this micro foundation, but it just falls out in the same way, right? So this neoclassical growth model, basically all these models where you have this idea, you have this production function, neoclassical production function, you have capital, right? And you have this diminishing returns to capital. These models predict that if you have a lower capital stock to start with, you will grow more. It's kind of this catching up idea, right? So I mean, that was basically what I showed you here, right? Maybe here. If you start here with a relatively low capital stock, what's happening here is that you start investing a lot. So I'm not calling it, you basically see an investment boom here, right? People suddenly invest a lot and your capital keeps growing, your economy starts growing, right? And you're moving here, right? And the further away you are from the steady state, the more you will grow, right? So that's something that this model predicts, right? If you're poor, if you're very far away from the steady state, you will grow more, right? And this is in a very, very strong prediction, right? And this is something that you can easily check, right? And I mean, this is what many papers have done, right? So this is just a plot, right? Just looking at data for GDP in the 1960s across, hope you can read this, 114 countries. So this is pretty much not really worldwide, but trying to be worldwide, right? Countries for which we have data, starting in 1960. And then here, this is like correlated with the growth rate of per capita GDP in the 40 years after. Right, so that's really the idea to look at this, right? These countries were poor to start with, relatively poor. If you're here on the left hand, right, you would be relatively poor. This is the relatively rich countries, right? And then the neoclassical growth model would predict that these poor countries are growing more. Is that what you see in this figure? No, right? I mean, the figure actually predicts the opposite, right? So in the figure, you have this positive slope, which means if I was a poor country, I was here, I was actually growing relatively less, right? And the richer countries were growing more. So this thing would actually tell you the neoclassical growth model is nonsense, right? Apparently, these poor countries are not catching up, right? That's what this figure tells us. Maybe that's true, right? Is it nonsense? Typical way to look at this is, okay, maybe this here is not true, but let's zoom in a bit, right? And now you already see a nice and negatively sloped line. So what did I change now? I basically do exactly the same exercise, right? GDP in 1960, related to like the 40 years afterwards, growth rates in GDP. But now, this is just for OECD countries, right? Which is more like developed countries. Think of this as a more homogeneous group of countries, right? Which maybe have a similar production function, have similar levels of productivity. So in terms of the lens of our model, it's more realistic to say that they are actually described by the same production function, for example, right? And here, this is actually already working pretty nicely, right? So here you kind of see this convergence story, right? Now you can make it even more extreme. So now I'm zooming in a bit more. The data is actually even much longer here. I'm starting here with GDP in 1880. This is for US states now. And the growth rates basically are more than 100 years afterwards, right? So this is intra-US, but across the different states in the US. And here's even more extreme, right? So there you clearly see this convergence, right? And this is basically why this literature, right? I mean, if you open papers on that, they say, it's not true that absolute convergence hold, right? Absolute convergence would be this figure here. So if you just do this across all countries of the world, condition on nothing, then it does not hold. But relative or conditional convergence holds. So what if you make look at a rather homogeneous group where it's maybe realistic to say they're described by the same production function, they're described by the same process for capital, for example, right? You basically, in terms of the model, you would say they have the same parameters, right, in your model, right? And then it actually turns out to be working rather nicely. I mean, one of the examples that we also keep discussing is their convergence between East and West Germany, right? I mean, that would be a natural thing you could look at here, right? Not so obvious, right? I would say the discussion is open. But I mean, if you see this, but I mean, this year is more than 100 years, right? I mean, we haven't had 100 years, I don't know. But that's one of these very interesting questions you could basically address here too, right? Through this lens, right? About conditions. Okay, so this is this conversion story. So I mean, just to say that, right? These neoclassical type of models make this very stark prediction about convergence, right? It is true that absolute convergence does not hold in the data, right? So if you compare, I don't know, Africa, South America, and North America and Europe, you will not see this pattern, right? But if you look more into a homogeneous group of countries, which is from a perspective of the model maybe a bit fairer, because that's actually what the model is doing too, right? It's setting the same production function for these very different countries, right? Then it actually works nicely. Okay. What else is the neoclassical growth model doing in a good way? Well, I mean, you may remember that I started my very first lecture was talking about these Caldo facts, right? We talked about this growth facts. And it turns out that the neoclassical growth model fits a lot of these facts, right? And this is kind of the reason why people started working with this model, right? You're basically matching all these kind of things here, for example, this constant labor share and so on, right? And this is really why, yeah, I don't know, when this model came out, people were saying, okay, this really seems to be something that we should start with, right? I mean, it has many things that it cannot explain. We already discussed some, right? But it also has some things that it can explain, right? And this is clearly this, right? Okay. Good. Questions? Maybe now let me use my last 5 minutes or so to talk about this here a bit. Maybe some of you have seen that before. So this is also what Solo actually kind of started doing, but you can also do it with the neoclassical growth model. This is what we call growth accounting. Right? So I mean, from a growth perspective, you really want to understand why is it that some countries grow, whereas others do not. So grow in terms of GDP per capita, right? You want to kind of get a feeling why this is in order to be actually able to maybe come up with some recommendations what these other countries could do, right? Or maybe should not do, right? And I mean, that's the kind of the starting point, right? And this is also where Solo started. And I mean, this is basically where he said, okay, wait. All this stuff that I showed you, we can actually use this to think about this, right? So in this growth accounting is in a way actually very simple. The only thing that you need is this production function, right? So it comes from this neoclassical production function. So say we produce, right, this is our output, and we produce with capital, labor, and productivity, right? And now what you do, either with the Solo model or with the neoclassical growth model, this is just the same thing, right? Because households for this year don't matter, right? So what you do is you take a derivative with respect to time, right? Just take this production function here, do a derivative, total derivative in this case with respect to time, because I mean, this is what time is doing, right? We want to understand growth over time, right? This is why with respect to time. And this is what this gives you. Right? I mean, basically just tells you do this for all your different parts of your functions, and always think about the marginal change in your in your function, right? So f prime k would be the marginal product of capital, f prime l is the marginal prime A, that's a term that I didn't have before, that would be here the marginal product of productivity, right? So if you increase productivity in the economy, how much more output you get. Okay. Then you do a bit of rearranging. This looks a bit ugly here, but basically the only thing that I do here is to divide this whole thing by output, right? I'm just dividing by output because that basically allows me, whereas this here is just derivatives, so changes, this here makes this all percent, which is nicer to interpret, right? So I'm dividing on the left-hand side by output. Output equals this here, so I also have to divide that all on the right-hand side, right? So this is basically where you see output here, here, and here, and then we do a bit of rewriting, right? But that's really just all that's happening here. And then what that means is that you can now nicely decompose your growth rate in GDP, which is the left-hand side, right? This is your percent change in GDP. And you can decompose this in what component is due to the change in the capital stock, what components is due to the change in your population, and what component is due to the change in technology, right? And this is why this is called growth accounting, right? It's basically an accounting exercise that you do, right? This all looks a bit ugly here. I mean, this is just to say, I mean, if you ever open these growth accounting things, they will exactly talk about total factor productivity, right? So this term here that I'm calling J, so this term here, which is basically this here, this is what we typically mean by total factor productivity, right? So basically just this idea with a total factor, it's not just related to labor or productivity, but it's really this idea, what if productivity goes up and how does that change output? Right? Okay. So, I mean, this here still looks a bit ugly, right? You have these derivatives here, so how do I know what this is, right? And now comes the neoclassical growth model, right? This here is the marginal product of capital, this here is the marginal product of labor. We know what this is. The marginal product of capital is equal to the wage, is equal to the interest rate, and the marginal product of labor is equal to the wage. And why is that helpful? Because these are things that I can observe, right? This is something where I just have to open the national accounts of my country that I want to study, and then I can get data about something like the labor share or data about something like the capital share, right? Which means you can actually put in data into this equation 20, right? So all you need is on the left-hand side is your GDP growth, and what you need here is basically these factor shares and the changes in the capital stock and the changes in your labor supply or labor in your economy, population, whatever, how you exactly matter it, right? But the point is, this is all stuff that you can observe, right? And out of that, we back out this G, right? So this change in overall technology productivity, right? And I mean, underlying here is, I mean, economists always talk about total factor productivity. We talk about productivity a lot, right? But this is really what we mean, right? So what we mean is, you take GDP, and you basically subtract from that, or the change in GDP, and you subtract from that the change in GDP, which is due to a change in capital, and the change in GDP, which is due to your labor input changing. And that's then what we interpret as productivity, right? Or the change in productivity, right? That's what we mean. And this is why we call this total factor productivity, right? Okay. Or sometimes you also call that the Solow residual. And this is how Solow came up with this major finding, when we basically said this G is important. This is what matters in the long run. It's this guy. It's not this or this, right? And I mean, this accounting exercise has been done across many countries, across many time periods. And I mean, this here is an example for the euro area, but that's basically not so interesting, because for the euro area, what you always see is that technology is not doing a very good job. That's what you see here too, right? One thing that I found very interesting, and maybe just to say that once people have used exactly this to decompose basically the growth experience in Southeast Asia, right? So in this case here, what we call this East Asian tigers, right? South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, right? And they basically thought about, what does it mean now, right? Where did this growth come from, right? I'm talking about this growth rates in the 90s, right? And you can just do what I showed you, and what you find is that this growth there was actually not so much due to technology. right? And this is where this finding was interesting. But there it was actually much more to not only capital, changes in capital also, but a lot to change in human capital, for example, right? Thinking about education, labor force participation, but also investment. Right? And that was actually interesting because it really showed us that basically like this growth that we talk about in the US or in Europe or wherever has been very different from this growth experience that we have seen in the 90s in Southeast Asia, right? And that's something we can nicely do. And I mean, one interpretation of that, and that's basically what's taken in that paper, is it will actually mean that this growth experience that you've seen there will not last forever. And I mean, in a way, that's exactly what you're seeing. Right, so that's in line with that. Good. Yeah, obviously you take assumptions for doing that, but as always. Good. All right. So yeah, that's basically what I wanted to show you. Right. I mean, in terms of methods, it's really like this: understand this model, understand this phase diagram, understand what's going on. And now this last part of this lecture was a bit like I wanted to show you some applications. Always also with the thing in mind, first of all, I want to show you what you can do with these models, right? You can change all kinds of things, you can introduce a government, and then what this actually implies and what we can learn from that, right? So that's basically this last part of the lecture. So what we will do next then is actually in my chapter 5, where we will move next week, is we will talk about how we introduce now business cycles into this model, which will be exactly related to changes in productivity. So that's my first step. And then later we will talk about endogenous growth. And I mean, both of this will exactly fall out of this model. Right? Okay. I think that's it. Thank you, and see you later.
Wir können ja mal schauen, was es hier gibt. Oh, ja. Was voll? Wie rein? Okay. War das nicht Techno? Ich habe auch schon so viel abgesagt, weil ich mir so denke, boah.
Sehr gut.
Das ist nicht deins, oder? Nee. Okay, dann gebe ich es einmal von ab.